I want to talk about the Renters' Rights Bill and you. What does this mean for your properties, whether you've got HMOs or single buy-to-lets? What are the new rules coming in? You may have already participated in other webinars, but I find that some other webinars perhaps don't go into the depth that I would like to go to tonight. What are some of the unintended consequences? What are some of the benefits of the Renters' Rights Bill? Aha, you might be surprised to hear me say that. But I think there may well be some positive consequences actually for us as landlords. Does this mean that you should be exiting from the market altogether and selling up all your rental property? Does it mean that you should get into commercial property instead of residential? What does it mean for you? Well, I want to think through some of those possible questions that you might have in your mind and reassure you that I don't think this is by any means the end of the world. I think they are significant changes, but we are still investing in property. And if I didn't have that confidence, I wouldn't be buying property myself, which we are. So I think you can rest assured that we're confident. And I think people who are educated will remain confident. We simply need to learn how to navigate these changes.
Is it worth saying where is it on the political spectrum at the minute? Because I,
Yeah, I'll come to that, Neil. I'll share where we
right.
are in that
Yeah.
in the progress. Yeah, definitely. That's a very important question. So, just a little bit about me, my background. I know many of you know me already. If you haven't already come across me or know me, what my background is, as you can see, these are some photos of me doing just kind of normal stuff, really. I've got a family, I've got four boys. I started investing in property over 25 years ago now, and slowly built up a portfolio of single buy to lets. And then about 10 years ago, I started investing in HMOs, and that got me out of my job, gave me financial freedom, and it has enabled me to do some amazing things. And this isn't really to say it's not a boast, it's just the truth that property has given me a very, very different lifestyle than I would have had if I was still in work. I've been able to travel the world. There's a picture of me and my boys in Brisbane at the World Cup. That was about a year and a half ago. An amazing time that we had there. The Women's World Cup, I should say, not the Men's World Cup, but the Women's World Cup. And the middle photo there is me and my four boys. My youngest son there is a bit younger, and my husband. And then photos of me doing other activities, which I love doing. I like running, skiing, keeping fit. I've run the London Marathon twice. I've run the Great North Run. I like to keep fit and stay active, and you need time to do that. And without property, I wouldn't have the time or the income to be able to, participate in these amazing sports and activities. So over the last 10 years, I've created a multi-million pound property portfolio. I started off with about 5 single buy-to-lets, and since then I've grown that portfolio into a series of portfolios, actually, because a lot of my properties, particularly my HMOs, I joint own with joint investors. So I have joint ventures with a handful of investors, and we've grown large portfolios together. I have blocks of flats. I've got commercial buildings now as well that I own, and I've learned how to raise finance from joint venture partners and learn clever ways also to secure property, such as lease options, which I've utilised as well. Over that time, I also launched a specialist HMO lettings agency called Best Nest, and it's my letting agency that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight to share what we're doing in our lettings agency to help our landlords, but also to make sure that we're doing everything to tick all those boxes so we remain compliant. And if you're managing your own property, hopefully what I have to share tonight will really help you as well. We've now got over 240 units in our property business in our lettings agency, and about half of those we own personally. I've written 2 Amazon best-selling books. You can see those on the side there: 101 Essential Tips for Running a Professional HMO and Extraordinary Profits from Ordinary Properties. And I also host a weekly podcast, HMO Success Podcast, where I focus on issues to do with HMOs and some of the wider pieces around legislation and changes that are happening in the market. As I say there, I've taken part in lots of different activities, the London Marathon, the Great North Run, and been very fortunate to be able to raise money for charity, which I find very worthwhile, and I've been able to donate lots of money to some key charities that matter a great deal to me. And then you might know that in 2023, the HMO council tax group, which I headed up, and we've now changed our name to the HMO Action Group. We changed the law on council tax in individual rooms, and that was a very historic win actually for the industry. We were delighted when that happened, and since then, I've been again very honoured to win a number of different awards for my work in the sector. I was a finalist in the Property Week Awards. I won the Property Person of the Year Award with Blue Bricks magazine. I won Partners in Property Award. I've won the Platinum Property Partners Award for 2023. I won the HMO Lifetime Achievements Award 2024, and also the Inspiration Awards for Women, which is an international award ceremony hosted down in London. And Joan Collins was there on the night, would you believe it? And actually Nigel Farage as well, which is interesting. So last year was a busy year for me, and it was really good to see what I'd done, what I'd headed up, being recognised in the industry. Okay, so enough about me, but maybe you can see that I know what I'm talking about. I think I know a lot about HMOs, particularly professional HMOs. We don't really work in the student sector or in the social housing sector, and I think those have got some individualities within the bill as well. But tonight, I don't just want to focus on HMOs. I want to talk to you also about general buy-to-lets. How will this affect buy-to-let properties as well as HMOs? So here are some key points about the bill. You've probably heard that the government is abolishing Section 21. Well, that's true, because what they're actually abolishing is assured short hold tenancies. Now, assured short hold tenancies, as we know, are the standard tenancy that we would offer when we have a contract with a tenant. And because within the assured short hold tenancy regime, the Landlord and Tenant Act, I think this was 1996, the assured short hold tenancy assumed that in order to evict a tenant, you'd have to use what's called a Section 21 form. Well, because the assured short hold tenancy is going, that means that the Section 21 is also going. It sort of goes, they go part and parcel together. So that's the first big headline, is that no tenancy is going to be longer than 1 month rolling at a time. So assured tenancies are going to be periodic, and the rent period will not exceed a month. ASTs are going. So from the day when you first start a new tenancy agreement, it will be a rolling 1 month contract. But there is a caveat to that. Tenants will have to give 2 months notice to leave the property. So although the the periodic tenancy, falling into my own trap there, although the tenancy will be a 1 month tenancy, tenants will actually have to give 2 months before they can leave. So you've got a little bit more time than you currently have if the tenancy was periodic. So I hope that makes sense, that in terms of the timescales. And I'm going to in a minute tell you about how you as a landlord can give notice to your tenant if you want them to leave. Again, there are new Section 8 rules about that. Now, if you do rent to rent is a big strategy for people who are looking to get started in property, maybe don't have much money. They rent a property and then they sublet it to a group of tenants, and they would therefore, be effectively running an HMO, but the head landlord is not responsible for that. Well, from now on, in the new Renters' Rights Bill, the head landlord does take responsibility for making sure that those tenancies are run correctly. And the leases, the head leases that the rent-to-rent person rents from the head landlord will also be periodic. So there will be no tie-in, because under the AST regime, you could have had a 3-year AST, you could have a 2-year AST. It didn't have to be 6 months. The minimum was 6 months, but it could be much longer if you wanted it to. If you wanted to negotiate a longer initial term, you could do that. So in many cases where the potential landlord, the middle landlord, if you like, the person who's running the rent-to-rent strategy, they would say to the head landlord, can I rent this for 3 years and turn it into an HMO? The landlord will say, yeah, no problem at all. You can go ahead and do that. How long do you want? Let's write a contract for 3 years. And then the middle man, the middle person, the rent-to-renter, would then sublet that property to the tenants. Well, that won't be able to happen anymore. So that's quite a big change. If you want to increase rent, there's a statutory procedure, and we'll talk about that. If the tenant wants to challenge the rent or the amount by which the rent is increasing, that is also introduced in this bill, what the process will be. If a tenant wants to keep a pet, or if they are on universal credit or they have children, rules around these are also changing, which I will go into in more depth. The government is also going to introduce a new ombudsman. There is already an ombudsman if you are registered with an ombudsman scheme, which all letting agents have to be. But up till now, landlords haven't had to be registered on the ombudsman scheme. But you will have to be registered onto the ombudsman scheme, and you will also have to register your property onto a separate database if you want to let it out. And I think what will happen is that you will be given a unique code or number, and that code or number will have to be quoted when you are advertising or referencing that tenant. So you won't be able to rent out any property that isn't listed on a portal, isn't on this big database. But you'll also have to be registered with the ombudsman, and you'll be paying for that. That's an extra fee that you'll have to pay. And the ombudsman's job will be to mediate if the tenant feels that the increase in rent that you're asking for is too high. But again, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. Talk to you a little bit about the database. And then the final change, or the introduction of this, is what's called the Decent Home Standard, which up to now has been applied to the social housing area, the social housing market, but it's now going to apply to the private rental sector as well. So we'll cover that too. By the way, do feel free to ask any questions, put your hand up. If there's anything that needs clarification, please put a question in the chat panel and I will come to it. Now, it's quite interesting, but I think that a lot of landlords are now beginning to think, ooh, do we really want to manage our properties ourselves? We don't necessarily want to sell up. We want to still benefit from having rents. We still want to have the income that comes from having a rental property. You might set it aside for your pension, or you might decide that this is something for your children to have. You might like the idea of investing in bricks and mortar, and who doesn't? It's a great investment. It's the only investment that you can leverage using bank finance, legally. So why wouldn't you want to do it? But there are definitely going to be more administrative requirements and challenges, which I think is going to mean that a lot of landlords are going to think this is too time consuming, and I'm going to offload my properties to an agent, recognizing there's a cost to that, but the cost to not doing it might be higher in terms of their time. Now, Neil, you've got a very good question there. Any idea of the cost of the ombudsman and database? Well, you know what happens with government schemes. They often start off at a very small level and decide that they have to grow it. So I think it would probably be a matter of maybe £100 a year to start with, but every property you own will have to be individually registered on the database. And I suspect there'll be a small fee for registering each property that you own. And then you will have another fee for being registered with the ombudsman. We haven't been told what those fees are going to be, so watch this space. But I think that's going to also cause a bit of a wobble in the market.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got to hold our nerve here. We've got to realise there's some costs coming over the horizon, some changes coming over the horizon.
So just to be clear, it's for each property, HMO or single let, you've got to register ombudsman and database.
Yes, that's right. Well, you'll be registered with the ombudsman as your individual self. You'll only have to register once to be registered with the ombudsman, but each property will have to be individually registered onto the database. Yeah.
Oh, that's not so bad then. I was thinking it was 2 lots for each property.
No, I think it'll be just you as an individual or company with the ombudsman. You'll get your ombudsman scheme number,
Right.
Like we do as a letting agency. We've got an ombudsman scheme
Yeah.
number, and that covers all the properties that we manage. So I would imagine that's how they'll do it.
Probably.
Again, we haven't seen the detail, so I'm
Yeah.
speculating on this, but reading between the lines, that's what I think is going to happen.
Okay.
Okay. Now, because Section 21s are being abolished, the only way you will be able to possess a property will be through Section 8. So all evictions will have to use a Section 8 process. And I'm going to talk to you about those different Section 8 procedures. But the first one is to recognise that there are a couple which relate purely for students and also social housing. So there's a recognition here, I think, that there is a spread of different types of property, and that some landlords will need to get their property back to be able to re-rent them sooner than others. So there's a new student possession ground, I think it's 4A, and that will require landlords prior notice from the landlord to say to the students who move in, by the way, I will need this property back by next June. And they can't just sort of stay there indeterminately, because the landlord will need to get the property back and ready for the following academic year. So let's just go through some of the basics on evictions. What will be possible, what won't be possible. So first of all, although they are periodic tenancies, 1 month rolling tenancies, there are certain timescales and notice periods that have to be adhered to. The first one is that tenants have to give 2 months notice to quit. So in theory, they could move in on a Sunday and on the Monday give you their notice. And 2 months later, they could leave the property. And the notice can be served in any format, including text or WhatsApp messages. So if you're not very good at text and WhatsApp, I suggest you get better, because if you fail to notice that the tenant has texted you or WhatsApped you their notice and you miss it for some reason, if the tenant can prove that they served you notice in the correct way and then leaves the property, then they will be found to have given notice correctly. So it means that you're going to have to be a bit more perhaps assiduous at checking messages and so on if you're not brilliant at that already. Now, in terms of evicting tenants, if a tenant is behind, is in arrears with their rent, the mandatory threshold will increase from 2 to 3 months arrears. At the moment, you only have to wait for 2 months till that tenant is 2 months in arrears before you can serve them with their initial notice. That will increase to 3 months. And the notice period will increase from 2 weeks, as it currently is, to 4. So in other words, the tenant will have to be 3 weeks in arrears before you can serve the notice, the Section 8 notice. And on the notice says how long you've got before you will start court proceedings. Currently, that's 2 weeks. In the new Renters' Rights Bill, this has been extended to 4 weeks. So currently, you could have escalated a court order for possession within 2 months and 2 weeks. That would be the shortest period of time that a tenant would be in arrears, and you could have got that notice to be at the courts. About two months, 2 weeks, maybe a day. Now it's going to be 4 months. It's double the length of time, basically. Double, slightly less than double the length of time it will take you to get that possession notice escalated to court before you can then get a court order. So that's a little bit more of a risk. We have to have a think about that. Now, the other thing is that tenants will benefit from a 12-month protected period at the beginning of a tenancy, during which landlords can't evict them if they want to move in or if they want to sell the property. So if somebody moves in on, the 1st of January 2026, you will have to wait 12 months before you can evict them, unless they agree. If they agree to leave before then you're fine. But if they don't agree, they've got 12 months where they can stay in that property before you can legally get them out. And if you do decide you want to give them notice, you have to give them 4 months notice. So you have to give 4 months notice, and you can't market the property for rental again for 12 months after the notice expires or the claim is filed at court. So, you kind of get the feeling that Big Brother might be watching There's a couple of questions in the chat panel. Let me go to that. Bills all included in rent. What happens if utilities rise rapidly? This is a very good question, John. And I think hold on to that thought for a moment. I'll come back to that. I think it's an excellent challenge. I've thought about that. And I think I know what will probably happen, but it's a very, very important question to ask. Okay, Carl, so you're buying something already. Yes, that's right. That's C3. So you're moving from C3 to C4 and you'll require vacant possession, which is a very, very interesting, isn't it? Because you want to ideally have purchased that property prior to the Renters' Rights Bill coming in so that you can issue Section 21s. There is a question mark over any Section 21s that have been issued just prior to the Renters' Rights Bill, whether those will be invalidated. How damaging might that be? Implementation of this bill is a whole other headache. And again, I'll come to that. So there are a number of new grounds, and I'm not going to read through all of these. Again, you can go online and see them. And if you want to rewatch this webinar, hello again. Yes, it's still me. I'm still here. You can see there are a number of new grounds. Some have been amended, some have been changed, some have been introduced, in fact. So a new ground, for example, is about the landlord wanting to repossess the property in order to sell it. They've got to give 12 months notice. If a property was let to a student, that's actually already in but that will mean they've got again different timescales that they have to adhere to. Student landlords, again, this would be mostly student landlords running HMOs, small HMOs, not affiliated with an educational institution, who need the property for a new student tenant group before the academic year starts. So that's the new one that they've introduced. Right, Neil, you want to go back? Okay, this one. The last comment on the previous page.
Sorry, I didn't. Landlords won't be able to use the grounds when they sell a property in the first 12 months. Okay. We'll need to give 4 months notice and can't market the property for 12 months after the notice period expires. What?
So, in other words, if they change their mind. So let's say
I can't rent it.
Exactly. They can't market the property for rent is what it should say. Exactly.
Right. I was thinking you've got to give 4 months notice and you can't sell it for 12 months. Everyone's going to click immediately.
Sorry, it should say they can't market the property for rent for 12 months after the notice expires. Yeah. Apologies.
So if you don't get that right, tough titty.
Exactly. Quite. This is why it's a headache. This is why this Renters' Rights Bill is not an easy piece of legislation. But there's more. Here we go. Next page of all the different grounds. And as you can see, now these are all what we call mandatory grounds. So in other words, as long as you can demonstrate that you have met the requirements, the court should give you a possession order. So ground 5, if a religious organisation owns the property and needs a minister to live in there, if they can demonstrate that, the court will give them a possession notice. If a landlord wishes to demolish or redevelop the property to the extent the tenant can't live there, they can get a repossession order. Now, that is actually a very quick one. I think that is 1 month's notice. You only have to give 1 month's notice. So, first little hint, first little tip on navigating the Renters' Rights Bill. I think what you might find is some landlords become very creative about what they want to do in the property and decide that, let's say it's an HMO and they've got a tenant there, they want to redevelop that room. They realise that it needs a good, thorough repaint and possibly new carpets. Well, they can't possibly do that piece of work while the tenant is still living there. So they're going to issue a Section 8 to the tenant and they will get the possession order and the tenant will have to leave. They have to just give 1 month's notice. They might not even get the possession order from the court because they might simply issue the notice. The tenant might realise they're on a bit of a losing wicket and they might leave. But if the landlord needs to go to court, they only have to have given 1 month's notice for the judge to approve it, to get the possession order so that they can redevelop the room. I think you understand what I'm hinting at there. Again, absolutely right. Ground 6A, this is a new one. If the landlord needs possession to comply with enforcement action, let's say the local authority have said your fire doors aren't quite right, or there's a problem with your property, that would definitely be a reason for the landlord to be able to repossess a property so that he can do the work on it, or she can do the work on it. Ground 7A, serious antisocial behaviour. Now that requires a bit more than just you thinking it's serious antisocial behaviour or a neighbour complaining. You will have to provide evidence for that. Usually it will be in the form of a police report or an antisocial behaviour order, some kind of documented piece of evidence that demonstrates antisocial behaviour. But if you've got that, you can evict, and that's hopefully going to be a bit easier than the current situation, where it can often go to court, be debated, and then it gets refused. Often antisocial behaviour is a very, very difficult one to have the court agree to it. They often side with tenants when it comes to antisocial behaviour. If the tenant doesn't have a right to rent, that's another reason why you would give them notice to quit. And then ground 8, this has been amended, as you can see, if the tenant is 3 months in arrears, or 13 weeks if the rent is paid weekly or fortnightly. Oh, sorry about the spelling there. I should say discretionary. I missed out an A there. So we've talked about mandatory grounds. These are ones that if you can prove, basically the court can't say no. But there are discretionary grounds as well. Look at them all there. There's a couple of new ones. Ground 14A, this is for social housing. So social landlords can evict a domestic violence perpetrator if the victim has fled. So assuming that the victim has left the property, but you've still got the perpetrator in the property, you can evict them. If the ground 14ZA, this is a new one. Sorry, I think that should be 14.2a. Anyway, if the tenant or adult at the property has been convicted of an indictable offence during a UK riot. I thought, ooh, that's an interesting one. There we go, that's in there. And ground 18, this is a new one. The tenancy is for supported accommodation and the tenant refuses to engage in support. So supported accommodation providers will be able to evict individuals who are not engaging. Again, interesting. So there's a number of new grounds there as well. And I think as the amendments start to filter through, which I'll come on to in a moment, we'll see some of these slightly adapted and changed. So these are not the final versions. This that I'm telling you tonight is the current version of the Renters' Rights Bill, but it has not completed its pathway through the Houses of Parliament yet. It's at the committee reading stage at the House of Lords. So there's still another couple of steps to go before we have the final version, which will then be agreed and voted on and become law. So we've still got a bit of debate to go about what the final version is going to look like. Okay, Carl, no worries. Thank you very much for being here. Right, quick question. Reclassification of flat versus HMO room with kitchenette. I'm hearing a lot of feedback from investors where different regions and different building control officers have very different interpretations re HMO regulation. Yeah, it depends on whether they, it's a section 254 HMO where the council tax, I presume you're talking about council tax problem. If it's truly a section 254, you won't have any problems. If it's not a section 254, you may have problems. That's the simplest explanation I can give. But we can come back to that, Carl. I know we're going to have a call in the next few days, so we can perhaps talk about that then. But that's what I would look at. Look at what section 254 HMO is. See if your property fully meets that description. Then those rooms will not be classified individually for council tax. The problem is a lot of people think that section 254 HMO means that it can be fully self-contained. Each room can be fully self-contained and there will be no ramifications. Unfortunately, that's not true. And if you look at the legislation, it clarifies that. Thank you for being here and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Now, let's just move on to antisocial behaviour because there are some extra strengths, if you like, to the antisocial behaviour rules. So there's the under Section 8, you'll be able to possess a property for antisocial behaviour, and certain things have been added in. So one of the just to give you a bit of background about the Renters' Rights Bill, it's not actually a new bill. So a lot of people think it's a brand new piece of legislation. It's actually not. It's adaptation, editing about 7 other pieces of legislation that have come before it. So starting with the 1985 Landlord and Tenant Act. Then you have the 1988 Landlord and Tenant Act. Then you have the 1996 Landlord and Tenant Act, the 2000 Landlord and Tenant Act. I think actually, no, that 2004 is a Housing Act. And so it goes on. And the Renters' Rights Bill simply adjusts and amends parts of those different acts. So in the 1988 Act, this is what the Renters' Rights Bill says. In section 9A, in subsection 2, after paragraph C, insert D. So there are some insertions and changes to original legislation rather than a brand new bill. So that's why you can see on this slide, I've put this exact wording that comes directly from the Renters' Rights Bill. So antisocial behaviour, to paraphrase what's on the slide, simply it's going to be under 2 particular areas of Section 8. One of them will be a mandatory grounds. So this is where the landlord can demonstrate that the person has has created problems which have led to some form of evidence, either through the police or the local council. And then the second area, which is the discretionary ground, where the tenant is not currently engaging with the landlord to try and end their behaviour. So there's going to be quite interesting, I think, when that comes to court and is tested. Be interesting to see to what degree you can start to evict on antisocial behaviour grounds. HMOs have a special weighting in this as well, which you would expect. That's mentioned in the bill. That's good for HMOs. That the Labour Party have recognised that HMOs do have a kind of unique kind of place, a unique kind of type of living, and not being able to evict on antisocial behaviour can be very, very bad for other people living in HMOs. So they have recognised that within the bill. Okay, let's move on to rents. So how can you increase rents? Well, currently, of course, you can give your tenant 1 month notice. The legal rule is that as long as it's not within the first 6 months of AST, you can really give them a notice to increase their rent whenever you want to, as long as you give them 1 month's notice. What's going to happen with the Renters' Rights Bill is you can only do it once per year, and you have to issue a Section 13 notice, and you have to give 2 months' notice to the tenant of the increase. If the tenant doesn't like the increase or they think it's unfair, they can complain to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman will judge whether the rent is market rent or not, and will decide whether it's appropriate. And if they decide it's not appropriate and that the rent has to stay at the level that it was before, you will have to reduce the rent back to where it was before. Now, I personally feel this is very much about rent control, although many people have said to me, no, it's not rent control. Well, I don't see what else you would call it. To me, this is rent control by any other name, but that's just my view. So I think that rent increases are going to become more challenging and difficult to do. And you certainly won't be able to raise rents in order to get rid of a tenant, because the tenant will then be able to complain to the Ombudsman, and it will become pretty clear that you raise the rent above what would be considered reasonable by the Ombudsman, probably in order to get rid of the tenants. You'll have to find some other way of getting rid of the tenant. Now, another change that's going to happen is about pets, which is quite interesting because, of course, in an HMO, pets are not really the most appropriate guests to have there. Although we have had a few of our tenants have fish, goldfish, which, possibly actually that's a sort of help if you ever had a fire. It's definitely not an anti-fire risk. It might in fact be a help if they've got a big enough fish tank, and you could, get a jug by the side of it and use it to put out any fire that might occur. However, that's a side point. Generally, pets in HMOs don't work, and actually, there hasn't been, I think, in the renters' rights bill, the pets, the children, the universal credit bit can all be overcome. I think if you can give a reasonable reason why you don't want a pet, or why you don't think children are suitable, or why you've got a better applicant than the tenant who's on universal credit, it won't be a problem for you to choose people who are working, don't have children, don't have pets. I think that will still actually happen, but I think the government has kind of recognised that they just want to make it so that you can't discriminate in your advertising, and you can't discriminate in other ways against those individuals. You are allowed to insure your property, to increase the insurance for pets, and also increase any other costs. So I'll tell you at the end what we're doing to help our landlords if they do find out that the tenant has got a pet or wants to have a pet. And you can refuse consent. All that it is that the tenant may keep a pet at the dwelling house, and the landlord consents. If you don't consent, they still can't do it. So it isn't the Act is not saying you have to have pets, you have to allow pets, not at all. It's simply about being reasonable about why you've refused consent. And this is true also with children. If you feel that children are not suitable, and of course in an HMO they wouldn't be suitable, landlords and agents will continue to have their final say on who they want to let their property to. Again, it's simply having a reason and providing evidence. So if the tenant ever complained or said that you were discriminating, you could demonstrate why it wasn't a case of discrimination because they've got children. It's more a case that the property isn't suitable for children, and these are your reasons why. So here's an example. This is taken from the Renters' Rights Bill. Interestingly, it's an HMO example. A letting agent is advertising a small bedroom to rent in a house of multiple occupation. Hopefully, though, does meet the minimum room size. They don't say that, do they? Anyway, the agent clearly sets out the size of the bedroom and amenities available in the advert. A prospective tenant with 2 teenage children comes across the advert online, probably spare room. Although the bedroom is clearly quite small, the tenant believes the space can be managed. During the viewing, the prospective tenant mentions that she has 2 teenage children who'd be living in the property with her. The letting agent subsequently informs her that he cannot let to her and her children because the bedroom can legally only be occupied by one adult and a small child, which means that it must be about 8.5 meters squared. In this case, the letting agent could argue under section 32 brackets 2 brackets A. Remember that, everybody. I hope you've taken note of that so you can quote that in your evidence. The letting agent could argue that refusing to enter into a tenancy of the dwelling in order to adhere to overcrowding regulation is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, and as a result, the ban is lawful. I wouldn't really call it a ban, I would call it a refusal. You just don't want to enter into a contract with that person. And so it should be your right to be able to determine who you can enter a contract with. But that's another matter that we shall brush over. However, the point being that if you have a reasonable reason or a legitimate reason for refusal, that's absolutely fine. Now, what happens if your mortgage or your lease says that you can't let to those in receipt of benefits or with children? What happens then? Well, very interestingly, according to the Renters' Rights Bill, terms in mortgages and superior agreements which restrict the letting of a property to private renters without children or who receive benefits are of no effect. The government has decided any clause like that in a mortgage agreement or a lease agreement is now null and void. They are making that decision, which is pretty bold, isn't it? Because that mortgage company has assessed the risk of lending to you on the basis of who you're going to rent to and on the basis that you can pay the mortgage. And now, potentially, the mortgage can't be payable because, there's a higher risk because that person is on benefits. So I think this is a pretty harsh and draconian rule that the government are stepping in between you and the mortgage company and basically saying whatever the mortgage company says in their terms and condition is now null and void. Rent levels. Now, let's imagine you have a property that the tenant has moved out of. It's empty. It's ready to go. Maybe you've had it deep cleaned. It's ready to go again. How will you be able to advertise that property? Well, the rule is going to be that you'll have to publish an asking rent for the property. And that asking rent will be the rent that you will be expected to rent the property for. In certain parts of the country where there's huge demand for property, the letting agent can advertise at a certain level, but tenants are known to have to bid for the property. So they might say, well, I'll pay £100 more, or I'll pay £200 more. So you can get into these bidding wars. Now, the government wants to stop that. They want to make sure that everybody has equal access to properties and that letting agents effectively pitch the properties correctly. Of course, what it doesn't say is that you can pitch higher and come down. So that's probably what will happen, is that letting agents will start the bidding at higher, and it will be a case of coming down to the level whereby they have enough interest and they know they've pitched the property correctly, rather than bidding up, so to speak. I think that what's going to happen is that it's going to be much more common for rents to go up at the end of tenancies or at the beginning of new ones. I think what will happen is that landlords would think, well, I haven't raised the rent for this property for 2 years because it was difficult to do so. Possibly the tenant challenged the rent. So I decided I would just keep it running, for the foreseeable future. Now I know that I need to do some repairs to that property, so I'm going to have to evict the tenant. Once I've done the repairs to the property, then I'm going to increase the rent again. So I can see a lot more higher rents being put out there, being advertised at the end of an older tenancy where the rent has not been increased for a number of years. So marginal rates of rent will really start to go up. Now, the Ombudsman, whose role it will be mostly to agree what market rents are, will be the person who will interject, mediate if your tenant decides they don't like the new rent level that you've set. And they will also consider some complaints, but these complaints are on the behalf of the tenant, not on behalf of the landlord. They're not going to act on your behalf. They will only act on behalf of the tenant. So that's something just for you to notice, that you have to register, but it won't actually benefit you. And then the database, which you mentioned as well, will require some basic information, and you will be fined if you don't register on the database, and you will not be able to let your property, or in fact evict, if you are not on that database, if that property is not registered on the database. We haven't heard any more details about that. Nothing has been released yet. So these are a number of the pragmatic and practical parts of the bill, which I don't know to what degree they are being prepared. I don't know to what degree the civil service are creating the structure of the database, or who the ombudsman are going to be. I haven't seen any adverts, for example, for would you like to be a property ombudsman? Have you got experience in this? I would expect them to be starting to recruit like mad if they really want the bill to go live in the spring. But we haven't seen that. So it might be that it's a little bit more dribs and drabs for some aspects of the bill. Local councils have more power. So they will be able to impose civil penalties on landlords, on anyone who acts directly or indirectly on their behalf, up to £7,000 for any breaches. So the enforcement has become more strict and has become a bit more tight, I would say. It's going to cause, I think, some landlords to perhaps have a couple of sleepless nights, more than a couple, when they realise that the powers of enforcement are going to get greater, and the ability to fine will be greater as well. Now, you've probably heard about Awab's law. So this was the law that was brought in to apply to social housing as a result of this little boy who died because of damp and mould in his council house. In the Renters' Rights Bill, Awaab's law will be applied to the private rental sector as well. So this will enable tenants to complain about damp and mold. And in the bill, it's very clear that they don't want us to blame tenants or tenants' behaviour for damp and mold in the property. It will be your responsibility as the landlord to fix this problem within a specified time period. And tenants will be able to bring enforcement action if you don't comply and sort out the problem. So I think damp and mold is one of those areas which constantly needs education. We regularly email our tenants to remind them how damp and mold forms, often because there isn't enough airflow or because the room is very cold. And they need to turn on the heating a little bit, but mostly it's airflow. If they have a bit of airflow in the room, if they have the extractor fans on, if they open their window just for half an hour a day, this actually distributes the condensation and moisture in the air, and it's often a way of getting rid of damp, and therefore mold spores don't grow. And even on cold external walls, if you reduce the humidity of the room, the moisture doesn't form mold and black mold in the corners of the rooms. But many tenants don't understand that. They are want to keep their rooms warm, and so they keep the doors and windows closed, but actually that is counterproductive. Right, another aspect of the Renters' Rights Bill. Hope we're doing okay, everybody. Hope you're there with your stiff drink and cracking on, making your notes. Now, deposit protection rules are also going to be changed. So at the moment, under the Housing Act 1996, a landlord can't serve a Section 21 notice unless the deposit protection rules have been adhered to. Because the Section 21 is now going, Renters' Rights introduces an equivalent protection or provision. So what this means is that a court will not award possession under any ground except grounds 7A and 14, which are the antisocial behaviour grounds, unless the landlord has properly protected the deposit. So it's even more important that you properly protect the deposit. And there's a number of steps to doing that, again, making it more complicated. But actually, this has been in the law for a number of years, and you've always been running the risk of not being able to evict if you haven't been protecting the deposits correctly. But the difference will be that unlike the current rules for Section 21, the landlord doesn't have to serve the prescribed information. It's just that the deposit must be protected in the scheme. So that lessens a little bit of the administrative headache there. Now, in terms of the introduction of this bill, it will be introduced in one stage, and one fell swoop, it will come in. But we still don't know the date of it. So we really have to be very aware of keeping an eye out in the news, commentary, property pages of newspapers, industry magazines. Keep reading those email alerts. As soon as it's announced, we will know about it. There will be a bill schedule that will be released into the House of Commons once it's gone through the final reading of the Lords. At the moment, it's the committee stage of the Lords, so that now then has to go for a final reading, and then following that, it will be presented back into the Commons for its final agreement and voting it through, and any amendments will be included in the final bill, and then it will become law. Now, as I say, there are a number of bits of the bill which are still kind of vague. We still don't know the detail about them. So how they're going to actually produce this and have it ready for spring, I don't know. Some people are speculating it's not going to be till October in reality. I think we've just got to keep our ears and eyes on high alert to see if we hear or read anything. Neil, you've asked a good question. And will you have to give back the deposit as you would with a brand new AST? Do you mean when the new bill comes into play?
Yeah.
Yes.
But currently, if you do start a new AST, you have to give them the deposit back and then regather it and redeposit it and protect it and whatever.
Reprotect it, exactly. I think that has been a question raised, and I think it is likely that yes, the answer is yes. You will have to reprotect that deposit. So any deposits you currently have in the current regime will effectively all come to an end on that day, and then you'll be required to re-secure them, re-protect them, because effectively you'll have a brand new agreement with your tenant. On that one day, all ASTs, all current contracts will come to an end. Everybody will be on a periodic tenancy from that day.
Oh, goody, more expensive.
Correct. Absolutely. Now, student HMOs have got some other particular problems which I don't think have been thought through. For example, at the moment, if you have a group of students taking on a student HMO, they would normally do something called a joint and several liability tenancy. So they all rent the house for, say, 9 months or maybe a year as a group. And if one of them was to, flitter off and decide they don't want to carry on with university, the other tenants would either cover the rent or they'd find one of their other friends to cover and to move in and take the part of the tenant who's the student who's gone back home. Well, with the new law, the new bill, that won't be possible. Effectively, what will happen is that because there will be no such thing as ASTs, if somebody decides they no longer wish to be part of that household and they decide they want to go back home or get a job and leave university, the whole of that contract will end. So the whole of that agreement as a group will effectively come to an end. And at that point, the landlord could decide to take back the property and then re-let it to professionals or another group of students. So that's one outcome. Another outcome would be that the other students say, well, actually, we really want to stay in this property. We don't want to go. Please don't evict us. But because the tenancy has come to an end, the landlord is now going to have to find one more person to fill that room. And the other four, let's say 4 or 5 students, they might have a brand new tenancy agreement that starts from that particular day when the other tenant has left. The other problem that student landlords might have is that tenants could go in dribs and drabs. They could give 2 months notice. The first person might give 2 months notice on the day they move in October. Then Jane, who's got room 2, her course actually ends in March, so she doesn't want to stay till June and pay rent till June, so she gives notice in January. But that means that in March, let's say it's my property, I'm a student landlord, I have now got a 5-bed HMO where there are 2 voids, 2 vacancies, but I can't fill them because the other 3 rooms are still filled with the other tenants who moved in the previous September and want to stay till June. So this is going to become very, very messy for students and landlords. And what's even more pernicious, I feel, is that the private rental sector is being treated differently in this bill to the purpose-built student accommodation sector. In PBSA, they are not subject to the Renters' Rights Bill. They can issue their own agreements. They almost mirror serviced accommodation agreements, actually. They're short-term lets, but they can determine set lengths of time as well if they wish to. So if you are a PBSA operator and you've got a group of students who come to you and say, yes, we'd like to live together in one of your flats, you can offer them a 9-month agreement, a license, which ties them in for 9 months, and you are not subject to the Renters' Rights Bill. So I think this is very pernicious when it comes to the private rental sector. So there's going to be some student landlords that have properties empty for much longer. Some student landlords will have already seen the writing on the wall and will be thinking, I'm not going to rent to the student sector anymore, and I'm going to turn it into a professional or supported living property. And some student landlords will just try and get out of the sector altogether. But whichever of these factors happens, there's much more uncertainty for tenants, there's much more uncertainty for landlords, and this could affect the student market quite deleteriously long term. Because the one thing that students need to know is when they go to university, there's accommodation, and that accommodation is available for 9, 12 months. Many of them pay for 12 months, even though they only stay for 9 months, because that's what the student landlord requires. So watch this space. I think it could become very rocky. Now, with professional HMOs, as we've said, tenants will need to give 2 months notice to quit. And I think this is potentially quite an issue for tenants, and they might not realise that this is on the horizon. Most of our tenants who live in HMOs, in fact, even the ones in our single buy-to-lets, they if they get a new job offer, that job offer might be wanting to start in another month's time. And now they're going to have to say to their employer, I'm very sorry, I can't come and start that job in 1 month's time. I've got to give 2 months' notice to leave this property. Alternatively, what they will do is they will say to the landlord, well, I've got to go in a month's time, so just keep my deposit for the second month that I can't pay you. Well, okay, that's sometimes a solution, and that will benefit the landlord, because the landlord will have the benefit of the house or the room being empty. They can refill that house or room, and they've also got the benefit of keeping the deposit, because that second month when the tenant has left, they can keep the deposit. However, what if that property also needs some repairs or maintenance done to it? The tenant has now left after 1 month, not two, they've left after 1 month. There's repairs that are needed to the property, and the deposit doesn't cover the repairs and the loss of rent. You could be out of pocket quite significantly, because deposits have to be capped at a maximum of 5 weeks rental, not 8 weeks rental. So if that tenant gives you notice and decides that they want to, go off straight away, you've only got 5 weeks deposit to cover any losses. Again, it doesn't add up to me. It's pretty poor in terms of end-to-end thinking on this particular bill, I think. So there may be some higher turnover. There may be higher turnover. I think there will be more instability for tenants, actually, because tenants generally want to move on quicker. They want to leave quicker, and I don't think they're going to really. I think many of them do not realise they'll have to give 2 months' notice to leave. And it might be that HMOs perform better as a short-term let, where you just put in a serviced accommodation contract, not a periodic tenancy, and you don't run it as a licensed HMO. You run it as some kind of short-term let property, furnished holiday let. Although, of course, the tax rules are changing for those as well in April. So don't think you'll get any benefit from tax changes now, because those have been cut as well. So the result in professional HMOs is, I think there's going to be more variability, more variance in agreements about length of time, and negotiation needed for the return of the deposit. But what is very interesting is some of the research I've done shows that we probably don't need to worry too much at the moment. So despite this doom and gloom that I may be painting a picture of, actually, my research shows that younger households are more likely to move in the next 6 months than older households. This is a statistic that I have had from Rightmove. And it shows very clearly that older households are really very happy to stay where they are. So we have in that middle section the sort of teal coloured, and if you're just listening to this, you won't know what I'm talking about, but we have a diagram here that shows owner occupiers, private rental, the private rental sector, private renters, and then social renters. And the people who are most likely to move from a private rental property are younger households. And I think younger is classed as 45 and under. So 46 and older is supposed to be older households. And only 9% of them are going to be moving in the next 6 months. So that's only still 1 in 5 people under the age of 45 who are thinking of moving in the next 6 months. And in fact, it's interesting because another statistic shows that although younger households do tend to move more, they're actually staying put for longer. And if we look at the numbers of people in private rental property aged between 16 and 54, 57% have been living in their home for less than 3 years. But 24%, well, actually, over the age of 55, 24% have been living in their home for less than 3 years, if you understand what I'm saying there. In other words, 57% of younger people have lived it for less than 3 years, but that means that 43% have lived for more than 3 years. So that's still quite a high proportion of people who are staying much longer in their properties. And generally, as we can see across those three sectors, owner occupiers, private renters, and social renters, interestingly, the people who stay for the longest are probably what we would predict it to be, which is those aged 55 or over and in their own home. The next group that stay for the longest are social renters who are 55 and over. That's 9%. And then, interestingly, whether you're an owner occupier, a private rental, an owner occupier or a social renter, aged between 16 and 54, you have an equal sort of chance of staying in your property for up to 3 years. The conclusion is that people are staying longer in their properties. And in fact, this graph that I'm showing on the screen, this is the most recent English housing survey. We're waiting for the 2024 one to come out, actually. I don't think there's been one later than that. Private renters typically stay in their property for about 4.3 years. So that's about 4 years and 4 months. That's the average length of stay. So I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of turnover. And in fact, as landlords start to exit, I think we're going to see people wanting to stay longer. The challenge is going to be increasing the rent. But if what I'm predicting comes true, which is that we see marginal rent start to go up, I think it's very likely that the Ombudsman cannot deny that the market rent is much higher than it was when you first rented out your little flat on West Street, and that rents have actually gone up by 20%. And therefore, it's very reasonable of you a year on to increase your rent by 20%. On spare room, this is again interesting to look at room ads versus new renters versus average rent. So this is again going back about a year. And this is what Spare Room said. When we recently polled landlords, a third told us they were reducing the number of properties they have this year, and 16% said they were quitting altogether. So what we see in this graph is that although room adverts have actually gone down slightly, I mean, they're reasonably steady, but I think between 2016 and 2021, you can see that there was a little bit of a peak there and they've come down. Although that might be because people are staying longer in their HMO rooms. It might not be that it's just that there are less on the market. It's that they're the ones that are available are filled with tenants. You can also see there was a very big peak in new renters between 2022 and 2023, and average rents have slowly been ticking up, heading for the 800 mark, which is very, very high for a room. So it's a case of hanging on in there, because as long as you have got a well-run HMO, you will still carry on making money from it. However, a question that came up earlier is, what do you do if your bills start to go up, your utility bills start to go up? So one of the things that we're looking at in Best Nest is our contracts. We obviously are going to have to look at our contracts in terms of the new when the new renters' rights bill comes in. And part of that contract, part of that periodic tenancy is going to have a clause in it for fair usage of bills, a fair usage of utilities. And what we will be doing is carrying out more regular checks on that utility provision. And if we feel that we need to increase the cost for tenants above and beyond their rent, in order to keep that fair usage policy running and to get them to pay for more of the utility bills, that's the way to do it. So having a fair usage policy in your contract is going to be the key to enable you to then charge something extra to the tenant. And if the tenant doesn't want to pay, you can then make a deduction from their deposit. I also think what might happen is that, whereas at the moment we only charge half a month's rent as a deposit, it's very likely that we're going to have to increase that and ask tenants to pay a full month's rent because of this new 2-month notice that they're going to give. I think it's very likely they will be leaving after a month, and they need to give 2 months so that we can refill that room. Now, interestingly, from the point of view of demographics, in 2022, 35% of the UK population were renters, which is amazing, isn't it? quite a lot of people, large proportion of people are renting property. Majority of these were in the private rental sector. The average tenancy length is 4.3 years, which we talked about. And interestingly, the average age of a household reference person, I don't know what a household reference person is. Is it somebody who's very good at referencing things? No, I don't think that's what it is. I think it's when it talks about the census, it's the kind of median age of somebody in a rental accommodation. And in the private sector, the average age is 41. The median age is 41. The household reference person, if you want to go and ask them for, a quote from Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica, that's your man, because they're a reference person. But they're basically, the median age is 41. So, that median age of renters is definitely going up. And as we can see, as people get older, they like to stay longer. So I think we're going to see this more in HMOs. We've started to see it in some of our HMOs. Even in some of our family lets, we see people who want to settle down. They don't want to move out. So I am not too worried about there suddenly being a massive exit and that tenants are suddenly going to leave. I think what's going to happen is that the challenge is going to be on the paperwork, making sure that you have your paperwork and your systems right, because I actually think that it's going to be of benefit to you if you're a landlord, the Renters' Rights Bill, and it's going to be detrimental to tenants long term. So what about straight away? Okay, so let's imagine that the Renters' Rights Bill, Angela Rayner comes on the telly tomorrow and says, right, as of the 1st of April, very appropriate date, as of April Fool's Day, we're going to implement the Renters' Rights Bill. What do you need to do? Well, I think the first thing is you'll probably want to consider, if you've got any tenants that you are unsure about right now, or you're not very happy with them, or you don't feel that they're going to be safe long term, you want to issue Section 21s now, or maybe even Section 8s. So you can get better tenants in before the Renters' Rights Bill is implemented. Why is that? Well, because we can see it's harder to get rid of them. So you want to reduce the number of people who are possibly going to get into rent arrears before the Renters' Rights Bill actually comes into effect. So have a think about doing a bit of an audit of your current tenants. How good are they? We've got a landlord that we're managing for at the moment. He doesn't live in the UK. It's hard for him to understand all the rules and regulations, but he has a tenant who's in arrears, and we've been recommending to him for weeks that he must escalate this to court to get rid of this tenant. And he's a little bit worried about doing it, and he's a bit nervous about doing it. But I've said to him, under the Renters' Rights Bill, if you don't do this, you could be stuck with this tenant for much, much longer. So you must do it now. So there is a bit of an urgency to think about which tenants you've got that you might not ideally want, in which case now is the time to, say goodbye. If you want to sell, now is the time to get your property on the market, because once it's on the market, you can't change your mind. Well, you can change your mind, but you won't be able to then turn it back into a private rental property for 12 months. You've got 12 months. So once it's on the market, it's on the market. You've got to go through with it. That is, of course, unless the tenants have agreed to move out. So if you haven't actually had to use the full Section 8 for them to move out, and I can see there'll be quite a bit of bribery involved potentially, then you would be able to put it back up for rent. But if you've used the full Section 8 and you've got a possession order, then you won't be able to put it back on the market for renting. Set the rent levels carefully, because you can only increase them between tenancies or once per annum. So make sure that the rent you're asking is a rent that you're expecting to get. And don't be too quick to negotiate down to fill a room or a property. I think people are going to be more resistant to short voids. In the past, my advice has always been rent a room, because there's no point hanging on for higher rents, because every week that goes by, while you're hanging on for another £100 in your monthly rent, you're losing £120. So you might as well accept a slightly lower rent, because then your voids are going to be much less, and it's voids that kill cash flow. But I think under the Renters' Rights Bill, my advice is going to be a bit more patient to try and get those higher rents, because it's very likely you will get those high rents. And once you've got them, it's going to be harder to increase them. So you want to pitch the marginal rent a little bit higher. And yes, you'll have perhaps a little bit more of a void, but eventually it'll reach that level and it'll plateau at that level. And I also think that landlords and letting agents are going to charge for as many additional fees as they can. So whether it's losing keys or pet fees or anything that you can charge, and we have to be mindful of the Tenants Fees Act, which I think came in 2014, that stopped you from being able to charge letting agency fees and admin fees and so on for setting up the tenancy. You can't charge those anymore. But there will be some things you can charge for. And I think now there will be very little reason that tenants won't be charged those fees because landlords and letting agents are going to try and make extra money wherever they can. Right, Neil, great question. So at the start of the Renters' Rights Bill, there'll be a new contract with fair usage clauses. That's what we will be doing. I suspect that the government will be producing its own standardised periodic tenancy. That's what normally they would do. So they would produce one that you can then download and use yourself, and check whether it's got a fair usage clause in it. Because if it hasn't, you might want to insert one. If so, can you put up the rent at the start of the Renters' Rights Bill? Yes, I think you probably can, although you would have to give your tenants sufficient notice. So this is probably what the government are a little bit cautious about, because if they introduce the bill and give us enough notice, then as landlords, we're going to be going, right, Bob, room 3, you're out. Sylvia, room 6, I'm going to put your rent up. Hassan, who's in this particular property, I'm happy with you, but I want to instill a guarantor for you. So you're going to do a kind of audit of all your properties, and you're going to decide which tenants you want to keep, which tenants you don't want to keep, how you're going to evict them, etc., before the Renters' Rights Bill comes in. On the other hand, if the government want this chop over straight away, that's great for the government, because all those people go on to new periodic tenancies from day one. But immediately that happens, you will not be able to put up the rent for another 6 months, because you can only do it once a year. Or in fact, I suppose you could give them notice on the day after the Renters' Rights Bill comes in. You could give them 2 months notice, but bear in mind that rent will then have to stay the same for 12 months. It's a bit like playing a game of chess, isn't it? So what are we doing at Best Nest? So this is my letting agency. There's my lovely team there, who all help to keep our rooms filled, our houses filled, and our landlords happy, as happy as possible. So a few things we're doing. So we're introducing rent guarantee insurance. We've been working with Good Lord to enable this to happen. And this will mean that all tenancies will be covered by rent guarantee insurance. So that means that the landlord has security that if that tenant doesn't pay, as long as all the other criteria are fulfilled, and we'll have to make sure that those tenants fulfill that criteria, we can claim the lost rental and also any legal costs for evicting the tenant. And I think a lot of letting agents are now starting to do that. Next thing is guarantors. We are now using guarantors all over. Literally 100% of our tenants now have guarantors. We don't now take a tenant without a guarantor. It helps from the point of view of making sure the rent will be paid, but also from a point of view of antisocial behaviour. It's very effective at deterring bad behaviour. Thorough vetting and sifting of tenants. If they don't meet our requirements, don't meet our standards, we don't take them on. Sometimes that leads to us taking a little bit longer to fill rooms, but we've noticed that in the last 18 months, since we've been more and more assiduous at this, and we've got much better at it, our rent arrears have gone down, our occupancy rates have gone up, and the rates at which people leave properties has also diminished significantly. So it means that landlords have certainty about people who are moving into their property. You sometimes find in the first few months you get a little bit of turnover, but then it settles down and you have long-term tenants. So we have a number of HMOs now where the tenants have been there for a long time. And we're seeing the same in single buy-to-lets as well, in family lets. Once people have gone through all of that, from a tenant perspective, they also don't want to necessarily move. It's a headache for them. They've got to fill in more forms. They've got to get references. They've got to get updated data to be able to prove that they've got the right to rent, et cetera, et cetera. It's a real headache for a tenant to move. It's really hard. They don't want to move. If they can avoid moving, they will avoid moving. Checking income and determining the risk of that tenant is going to be critical. And where in the past you might have taken a bit of a punt on somebody, that probably won't happen anymore, because you'll have to be super careful, because evicting them is going to take longer and be more expensive. You'll also want to find out what their choice is, or what their plans are regarding length of stay. What's the likelihood that they will move soon? Because with the Renters' Rights Bill, you will probably prefer tenants who are going to stay longer. Although, if you feel that rents are going to carry on going up, you might actually like tenants to move out quicker, because then you can put the rents up. There's pros and cons to both. But I think you'll want to assess how long that tenant is likely to stay for. You'll probably want to have a pet policy. So we've got a pet policy now. We have a very clear policy that determines what happens if somebody has a pet, or they want to have a pet, and the landlord agrees. There's a fee they have to pay, and then there's an increased rent that they have to pay every month as well. And that's entirely in line with all the rules and regulations. We can do that, and it means that the tenant, again, is more likely to stay because they've got the pet covered, but also the landlord gets some money if they want to then insure the property for a higher amount, and they get some recompense for allowing a pet at the property and the risk of damage and so on that might bring. We're also changing our documentation. So we have an online system, which is a very, very good online system, and allows us to prepare documents before they go live. And the team of the software that we use are working on that right now. So we know on the day when we go live, that documentation will go live immediately, and it will immediately turn over, or everybody will get new periodic tenancies. We will probably have a couple of days where we have to sort out the deposits, reprotecting the deposits. But apart from that, everything should hopefully stay the same. Now, this is just a quote from Good Lord. So we work with Good Lord on the rent guarantee insurance, and we also use Vouch, which is their referencing system. And what they have said is that landlords will probably want to make sure that their tenant quality is more important than ever. So this is really critical, to make sure that your tenants that are going into your properties are the right ones for you. Are they who they say they are? Can they reliably pay the rent? Do they have a backup option, for example? And that's why we have guarantors as well as rent guarantee. Are they employed and it's affordable for them? And do they have good references from previous landlords? And I would add to that and say, maybe also a character reference, and also an employer's reference. Again, all of these are going to be a bit of a nightmare for tenants, but I think landlords are going to want to know that their property is safe and sure in the hands of people who they don't know. They're renting to you for the first time. So how do I think this is going to affect tenants? Well, I think rents will definitely jump between tenancies. That's very likely to happen. 2 months notice will stop tenants' ability to move fast. So if they have got another job or they've got a reason to move, they'll have to give 2 months notice. They're probably going to lose their deposit. So tenants, unless they're organised and can foresee when they need to leave, it's very likely that I think that many of them will lose their deposits. They're probably going to need guarantors. If they've got bad credit, it's going to be a case of bad luck. Sort out your bad credit before you apply for a property. I think family houses to rent will be like hen's teeth, because we've seen many landlords sell up. We're seeing more properties coming onto the market now as landlords decide they don't want this hassle. They don't want to do all of this anymore. There will be additional costs for the tenants too. Pets insurance and other fees that maybe normally the landlord would have absorbed, they're going to be passing on to the tenant now, as we saw earlier in the discussion about utilities, gas, electricity, etc. Current tenants will be put at immediate risk if they're not perfect tenants. You want to take action very, very quickly on a tenant, because you'll be thinking this could lead to significant delays. And because I have to only evict using Section 8, I need to make sure that I do this quickly. And for a tenant who might be looking for a job on the other side of the country, they're going to have to make sure that their new employer realizes that the Renters' Rights Bill might mean they can't start that job for another 2 months when they'd hope to start in a month's time. If you're a self-managing landlord, what should you do? Well, the first thing is you've done the first step, which is education. You now understand what are those different aspects of the Renters' Rights Bill that are going to affect you and that you need to understand to implement. Paperwork, documentation, systems, something I've been going on about for years and years and years, because it's very, very important. If you're not already organized, this is the time to do it. You need to make sure that you will use that periodic tenancy, which again we haven't seen a copy of yet. We don't know what that tenancy pro forma or template is going to look like. But believe you me, I think it's very likely the government will release that, and you can use that one. Gen up on the Section 13 notice as well. If you haven't used the Section 13 notice as well, just Google it. It will come up on the Government UK website. You can download it, have a look at it. And remind yourself also about Section 8 and the procedure for issuing a Section 8 notice. Understand how you have to, quote on the specific grounds, understand the difference between mandatory and discretionary grounds, so that you can be educated and you're practiced at this. Make sure that you're organized. So you need to be using some kind of online calendar or some kind of entry system, CRM system, that gives you dates and deadlines, because this is going to be critical if you're going to be issuing notices, even things like securing and protecting deposits, making sure that you've done all of that, having a good checklist to make sure that you've done everything that's needed to be done, so that if you need to evict, you can demonstrate you have fulfilled all your obligations prior to that tenant starting the tenancy. Be scrupulous about choosing tenants. Don't just wing it. Don't just think, oh, well, they're good enough, or they're willing, they say they're willing to pay this rent and it's a little bit higher than I thought I could get, so I'll accept them. I would probably rather have a good tenant than a tenant that pays high, because getting rid of a bad tenant, if they promise to pay £1,000 a month but they don't pay anything, I'd rather have someone who can pay £700 a month and carries on paying it. So be scrupulous about those tenants and think about what is the crux for you. Is it are you prepared to take the risk of asking for higher rents but not getting it? Or would you rather have somebody who agrees to a lower rent but pays it? Well, I know which one I'd rather have, but you can think about that in your own business. Ensure you understand the rules around preparing for a tenancy, the right to rent, how you're going to list your property on the database once that's released. We don't know that yet. Make sure you have all your certificates in place for your property. You've got those all on an online folder or a way in which you keep them so that you can access them quickly and fast, and you can send them to the tenant when they move in. And also you need to make sure that, as well as sending all the correct information to the tenant, that in terms of when you take the rent, you can only take 1 month's rent up front at the start of that tenancy. So you're not going to be able to take more than 1 month's rent at the beginning of the tenancy. So if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I'd like to pay 6 months up front, that you can't do that anymore. That has been abolished. So students won't be able to pay from their student loan at the beginning of a term, because it will be too many rental periods up front. They will only be able to pay month by month by month. And I can see again the risks there that, students will think, fantastic, I've got all this money. Great, we're going to have a great few weeks. Hold on a minute. Remember, you've got to pay your rent in December and it's only September now. You just got your student loan. You're going to have to make that last till Christmas. I mean, it's going to be good for tenants, good for students to learn some of those budgeting techniques and skills. On the other hand, how many of them are going to fall foul of that and spend it all up front? That's why generally, of course, in student accommodation, You get the rents for the whole term up front. Once the loan has come in, that's the first payment that the student would make. So they know their rent is covered and the rest of the money is what they live on for the rest of the term. So for all of these reasons, my final point is consider using a letting agency so that your headaches can be managed for you and you don't have to worry about it. And that's really where we in Best Nest come in. We're based in South Cheshire, and we cover South Cheshire, North Staffordshire, Crewe, and Stoke-on-Trent. And we're always happy to help landlords. We're always happy to help answer queries, do valuations, give you advice, and help you to build property portfolios that are profitable. So a few predictions before we finish. I think that there will be more landlords leaving the market. If your costs go up, you won't be able to raise rents unless it's once a year. But remember, you could have a fair usage policy in your tenancy agreement. You can't evict in order to increase rent. In order to increase rents, you have to give a reason. So this is going to, again, cause people to be a bit more cautious. There's going to be much more visibility about what you own because you're going to be on the database. So just bear in mind, no privacy. Action from local councils, it could increase. It could increase. I've said will, but it's a risk, but let's see what happens. I think there'll be more empty properties because people won't want to rent it out if they might want to sell, because they'll think, hang on a minute, if I decide that I do want to sell it, I'll have to wait 12 months. So I'd rather just keep it empty. That will lead to rents rising because fewer properties will be available. I think it's also going to cause further hostilities between landlords and tenants, because one of the benefits of Section 21 is that it allows what they call a no fault eviction. We just want to have our property back. Thank you very much and goodbye. But if you stay and navigate, you will do very well, because I think you can increase rents in between tenancies. And in some cases, those could be shorter than we currently have. And it might also deter tenants from not paying because they're going to find it harder to find somewhere else to move to. So I personally think it's going to be much, much worse for tenants than it will be for landlords. And maybe in a few months' time, we might have renters reform groups turning around and saying, oh, please change the Renters' Rights Bill back to what it was because we hate it. Let's see what happens. So that's us. That's me there in the picture with my team at Best Nest. If you have any queries, questions, or you'd like to explore the option of us looking after your properties in South Cheshire, North Staffordshire, we'd be delighted to have that conversation with you. That's our phone number. Contact@bestnest.co.uk is the best email to get us on, and our website is there.